I woke up because the house felt wrong. Not noisy, not broken, just quiet in a way it never was. For 32 years, even on the stillest nights, there had always been one sound threading through the dark, water moving over stone, slow and patient, like a breath you stop noticing until it's gone. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that grief had finally started playing tricks on me the way people warn it will. But when I swung my legs out of bed and stood there in the dark, listening, the silence stayed. It was just after 3 in the morning. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed an accusing blue. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't need to. I knew this house too well. I padded down the hallway past the framed photos I still hadn't moved. Martha laughing in the garden, Martha with dirt on her hands, Martha sitting by the creek with her shoes off, toes in the water like she was daring it to carry her somewhere else. The air still smelled faintly of lavender. She used to tuck sachets into every drawer, every closet, insisting it made the house feel alive even when the windows were closed. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, barefoot, the boards cool under my feet. The moon was low and bright enough to silver the yard, enough to show me the shape of the creek bed at the far edge of the property. And that's when I saw it. Where the water should have been moving, there was nothing. No shimmer, no ripple, just a flat, dead stretch of grey cutting across the channel like a scar that hadn't healed right. I walked closer, heart thudding harder with every step, and the smell hit me. Wet cement, sharp and wrong, layered over the familiar scent of earth and leaves. Someone had poured concrete straight across Willow Creek. For a long moment, I just stood there. It felt unreal, like a bad set piece dropped into the middle of my life by mistake. This creek wasn't some drainage ditch behind a strip mall. It was a protected tributary that fed into a larger watershed, something I'd spent half my career explaining to people who didn't want to hear it. And yet there it was, blocked off like it was nothing more than a nuisance. I crouched down and ran my hand over the surface. The concrete was still rough in places, edges jagged where it met the bank. This wasn't old. This wasn't something that had happened months ago while I wasn't paying attention. This was fresh, recent, deliberate. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was grief, sharp and immediate, like being told the same terrible news twice. Martha loved this creek. When the chemo was at its worst and sleep wouldn't come, she'd sit on the bench we built together under the cottonwood and listen to the water. She said it reminded her that things could move forward without rushing, that life didn't have to be loud to be strong. During her remission years, she planted the oak grove just upstream, insisting the roots would stabilize the bank long after we were gone. "Promise me you'll look after them," she'd said, half joking, half serious. "They're stubborn. They'll need an ally." Now the water that fed those oaks had been stopped cold. By the time the sun came up, I'd walked the length of the creek 3 times, documenting everything with my phone, though the habit was so ingrained it felt automatic. Old instincts don't fade just because you retire. The concrete dam spanned the entire width of the channel, nearly 3 feet high at its center, angled in a way that forced water to back up and spill sideways. I followed the diverted flow and felt my stomach drop when I saw where it was going, straight toward the low point behind my house. I checked the basement next. Water had seeped in along the foundation, a thin line at first, then a spreading stain that darkened the concrete floor. In 32 years, that basement had never flooded. Not once. I stood there in the dim light, listening to the soft drip from the utility sink, and felt something inside me settle into place. This wasn't just careless, this was reckless. By mid-morning, the Pine Valley HOA office was open. I drove there instead of calling because I already knew how that conversation would go over the phone. The clubhouse sat on the highest point of the development, manicured lawns rolling away from it like something out of a brochure. When I walked in, the woman at the desk gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I need to speak to someone about construction on Willow Creek," I said. She glanced down at her screen. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. But whoever authorized pouring concrete into a live creek definitely didn't have one either. That got me a look. A few minutes later, I was ushered into a glass-walled office where Veronica Ashworth sat behind a desk that probably cost more than my first car. She didn't stand when I came in. She didn't offer me a seat. She just folded her hands and smiled like this was already over. "You must be Earl," she said. "I've heard about you." "I'm sure you have," I replied. "You blocked my creek." She tilted her head, the way people do when they're about to correct a child. "We addressed a water management issue on HOA-controlled land." "Willow Creek isn't HOA-controlled," I said, "and even if it were, you can't obstruct a natural waterway without permits." Her smile tightened. "It was a temporary measure, mosquito control. You know how residents are." I stared at her, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. "You poured concrete," I said slowly, "into a creek that feeds a protected watershed." She waved a hand. "It's unsightly pooling near the clubhouse. Spring rains. We had to act quickly. Quickly doesn't mean illegally." Veronica leaned back in her chair. "With all due respect, Earl, you're retired. These things are handled differently now." That was the moment the anger finally arrived, hot and precise. "Differently how?" I asked. "By ignoring state and federal law?" Her expression hardened. "We're done here. If you have concerns, file a complaint with the county." I left without another word, but my hands were shaking by the time I got back to my truck. Filing a complaint wasn't a threat to me, it was a step, one I'd taken thousands of times on the other side of the table. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one Martha used to cover with seed catalogs every winter, and started assembling everything I needed: photos, timestamps, measurements. I noted the direction of flow, the height of the obstruction, the signs of sediment buildup already forming upstream. I pulled old maps from my files, documentation I'd kept out of habit more than necessity. Willow Creek had always been listed as a contributory stream. That hadn't changed just because someone in a blazer decided it was inconvenient. As I worked, the house creaked and settled around me, familiar sounds that grounded me. Grief had a way of making time feel slippery, but this was solid, concrete solid, a problem with rules and consequences, something I understood. By the time I finished the initial report, the sun was high, and the yard outside looked deceptively peaceful. Birds flitted through. The branches of the oak grove, unaware that their water source was being strangled. I walked out to the creek one more time and knelt there, touching the damp earth just below the dam. Water seeped through in thin, frustrated lines, searching for a way past. "I've got you," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure who I meant. The creek, the trees, or the memory of a woman who believed some things were worth defending, no matter how tired you were. What the HOA didn't know, what Veronica couldn't possibly have known, was that this wasn't just a homeowner upset about landscaping. This was the kind of mistake that sets bigger things in motion. And standing there, with water pressing against concrete in the early afternoon light, I already had the uneasy feeling that none of us had any idea how far this was about to go. Pine Valley liked to think of itself as exclusive, but what it really was insulated. The gates, the cameras, the uniform hedges, trimmed to identical heights. All of it worked together to create the impression that nothing truly bad could happen inside those borders. Problems were things you kept outside, along with leaf blowers before 9 a.m. and cars that didn't match the approved color palette. The HOA wasn't just a governing body, there was a culture, a belief system, and like most belief systems built on comfort, it didn't tolerate inconvenience well. When the neighborhood was first developed, the creek had been marketed as a feature. Natural waterway, the brochures called it. Serene views. Buyers were encouraged to imagine morning walks, the sound of water adding value to their investment. But features have a way of becoming flaws once they stop behaving on schedule. Heavy rains made the ground soft near the clubhouse. Water pooled where manicured grass was supposed to look effortless. Mosquitoes became the new villain, the kind people could rally against without asking too many questions. That was where Veronica Ashworth came in. She had moved into Pine Valley 5 years earlier, sweeping in with confidence and a resume that made people assume competence. Former pharmaceutical sales, then luxury real estate. She knew how to smile, how to speak with authority without saying much, how to make people feel taken care of while she made decisions for them. Within a year, she was HOA president. Within 2, no one remembered what it was like before. Veronica believed in control. You could hear it in the way she talked about the neighborhood, not as a community but as a product. Curb appeal mattered more than context. Complaints were noise, regulations were obstacles, and anyone who questioned her was, in her words, stuck in an outdated mindset. At the first HOA meeting, after the rain started, the creek came up as an agenda item under the vague title of water concerns. Veronica stood at the front of the room, arms crossed lightly, listening as residents complained about mud near the clubhouse and standing water after storms. She nodded, made notes, assured everyone it would be handled. No one mentioned permits. No one mentioned environmental review. Why would they? That kind of thing lived in a world far away from catered meetings and landscaping contracts. When someone suggested calling the county, Veronica smiled and said, "Let's not overcomplicate this." Behind closed doors, the conversation shifted. The maintenance contractor had ideas. A small dam, they said, just enough to redirect flow temporarily. Concrete was quick, effective, no need to shut anything down or bring in outside inspectors who would ask inconvenient questions. Veronica approved it without hesitation. In her mind, it was a problem-solving decision, decisive, efficient. What she didn't consider was that Willow Creek didn't bell. Ong to the HOA, no matter how close it ran to the clubhouse lawn. It existed long before Pine Valley did. It followed rules older and stronger than any set of bylaws printed on glossy paper, and it didn't care about property values. The construction happened early, before most residents were awake. Trucks rolled in quietly. Workers poured and shaped concrete with the practiced ease of people who had done this kind of thing many times before. By the time the sun was fully up, the creek's flow had changed, forced into a new path without ceremony. The clubhouse lawn dried quickly. Veronica congratulated herself. The first complaint she received wasn't from me. It was from a homeowner downstream who noticed soggy ground near their fence. She forwarded it to maintenance with a note that read, "Monitor." Likely unrelated. When another email came in about a strange smell near the creek, she dismissed that too. People always found something to worry about. Then my name appeared. "Earl Hutchinson is making noise about the creek," the office assistant told her, peeking into Veronica's office with visible discomfort. Veronica sighed. "Of course he is." She knew who I was, at least in broad strokes. Everyone did. The retired guy at the edge of the development, the one who didn't attend HOA barbecues and never volunteered for committees. The one who kept to himself and, more importantly, didn't need anything from anyone. People like that made her uneasy. She pulled up my file, skimmed the notes. Long-time resident, no violations, no fines, no leverage. When I walked into her office later that morning, she'd already decided how the conversation would go. Dismiss, redirect, close the loop. It was a pattern that had worked for her countless times before. What she didn't account for was experience. Not the kind you brag about, but the kind that sharpens your instincts until the feel like reflexes. When she told me it was mosquito control, she expected that to end it. That phrase had a way of smoothing things over, making people feel foolish for pushing back. Instead, I watched her carefully, listening not just to what she said, but to what she avoided saying. After I left, she sent an email to the board summarizing the interaction. "Resident concern addressed," she wrote. "No action required." Then she moved on to planning the open house for her own listing, a sprawling place near the north gate she was eager to sell before the market shifted. Meanwhile, the creek kept responding in the only way it could. Water backed up. Sediment settled where it never had before. The diverted flow began carving new paths through soil that wasn't meant to carry it. By the time the first real flooding reached my basement, the damage was already layered and complex. The HOA didn't see any of that. From their vantage point, the problem had been solved. The clubhouse lawn looked perfect. The complaints slowed. Veronica took credit at the next meeting, framing the decision as proactive leadership. Applause followed. People like results, especially when they don't have to see the cost. When the county complaint went in, it landed on a desk the HOA was familiar with. Pine Valley had a history of working relationships with inspectors, the kind built over years of minor issues, smoothed over with cooperation and convenience. Veronica wasn't worried. She'd handled officials before. A confident explanation, a site visit limited to HOA property, and it would be done. What unsettled her was the way I didn't back off. I asked for records. I requested documentation. I sent follow-up emails that were polite but precise, each one outlining a specific concern. The tone wasn't angry. It was methodical. That made it harder to dismiss. In the background, small cracks began to form in the HOA's confidence. The maintenance contractor mentioned additional pooling upstream. Someone suggested the concrete might need adjustment. Veronica shut that down immediately. Adjustments meant attention. Attention meant questions. At one point, a board member asked if they should consult an environmental specialist, just to be safe. Veronica's response was sharp. "Do you want to invite the federal government into our neighborhood?" The room went quiet. No one said another word. Power, when it's unchecked, starts to believe it's invisible. That was the HOA's real mistake. They assumed the system would bend the way it always had, that influence and polish were enough to override whatever rules stood in the way. They didn't realize that by pouring that concrete, they'd crossed a line that didn't move. As I continued documenting changes along the creek, I noticed how quickly things were evolving. Plants I hadn't seen there before were sprouting in the slowed water. The soil felt different underfoot, softer, richer. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a mess. To me, it looked like the beginning of something the HOA had no language for. Veronica, meanwhile, doubled down. She sent a neighborhood-wide email praising the successful mitigation project and reminding residents that unauthorized access to HOA-managed areas was prohibited. It was a subtle warning, aimed squarely at me without using my name. I read it, closed my laptop, and went back outside. The creek didn't care about emails. It kept doing what water does when you try to stop it. It adapted, found new ways forward, reshaped the land around it. What Pine Valley didn't understand yet was that this wasn't a battle of opinions or aesthetics. It was a collision between convenience and consequence. And once that kind of collision starts, it doesn't end quietly. By the end of that week, the HOA still believed it was in control. They had concrete on their side, a confident president, and years of getting their way without pushback. What they didn't have was any idea how fragile that control really was. And as I stood by the creek one evening, watching the water gather and press against the barrier they'd built, I knew something they didn't. The moment you force nature into a corner, you stop deciding how the story ends. The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning just after 9. I knew because I'd been awake since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with my notes laid out in neat stacks, listening to the distant hum of traffic beyond the gates. When his truck finally turned down my street, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation. This was the moment when things either moved forward or disappeared into paperwork. He introduced himself as Mike Castellanos, extending a hand that was firm but hurried. He wore the uniform of someone who wanted to look official without appearing confrontational. Khaki pants, a button-down shirt with the county logo, clipboard tucked under one arm. He glanced around my yard briefly, eyes skimming rather than settling. "So," he said, "you're concerned about a structure on the creek." "Concerned isn't the word I'd use," I replied. "It's an obstruction." He smiled thinly. "Let's take a look." We walked toward the creek together. I slowed my pace deliberately, letting him see what I saw. The backed-up water, the damp soil spreading farther than it should have, the faint discoloration where sediment was settling. He nodded occasionally, making a few marks on his clipboard, but he didn't crouch, didn't touch anything, didn't step off the path. "The HOA said this was temporary," he said. "Mosquito abatement, that's not a recognized emergency exemption," I said. "And see, concrete isn't temporary." He paused, finally looking at me. "You used to work in this field, right? For 30 years. Another nod. "Then you know these things take time." I did know that. I also knew when someone was laying the groundwork to do nothing. Mike took a few photos from where he stood, then turned back toward the house. "I'll need to check the area near the clubhouse," he said. "That's where the work was authorized." "The impact isn't limited to where it was authorized," I said. "The damage is downstream." He hesitated, just for a second. I'll note that, by the end of the visit, he hadn't stepped into the creek bed or measured the height of the dam. He hadn't looked at the flooded basement or followed the diverted flow. He thanked me for my time and said I'd hear back soon. The report came 2 days later. No violations observed. Issue resolved through HOA cooperation. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't incompetence. This was avoidance. When I called the county office, Mike answered on the second ring. "I understand you have concerns," he said, voice smooth. "You didn't inspect the site," I replied. "I conducted a visual assessment. From 20 feet away." He sighed. "Mr. Hutchinson, the HOA has been very cooperative. They assured us the structure doesn't impact regulated waters." "That's not their determination to make." There was a pause. "I'd recommend working with them directly." That phrase, "work with them," landed exactly the way I'd heard it countless times before, back when I was the one doing the enforcing. It was the language of convenience, a way to smooth over conflicts without ever addressing the underlying violation. After I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. Experience teaches you patterns. One of them is that when local enforcement fails, you widen the lens. I began documenting everything more carefully, not just the creek but the responses, or lack of them, from the county. I logged dates, times, exact wording. I saved emails. I recorded phone calls where it was legal to do so, my questions calm, my tone neutral. That's when I started noticing Mike's schedule. He visited Pine Valley more often than other neighborhoods. He parked near the clubhouse, chatted with staff, left without walking the grounds. One afternoon, as I sat in my truck across the street under the pretense of checking my phone, I watched Veronica step out of the clubhouse with him. They stood close, talking quietly. She laughed at something he said. Before they parted, she handed him a slim envelope. It wasn't dramatic. No furtive glances, no obvious secrecy, just a casual exchange between people who believed no one was watching. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't confront them. I didn't take photos. I drove home and wrote everything down while it was still fresh. The next call I made was to my daughter, Sarah. She listened without interrupting as I laid out what I'd seen, what the report said, what the creek was doing now. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Dad," she said finally, "if even half of that is documented, this isn't just a local issue." "I know, then stop treating it like one." Sarah was an environmental attorney, sharp in a way that came from living inside statutes and case law. Where I saw patterns, she saw leverage. She asked for everything I had, photos, reports, notes, and by the end of the call we had a plan. The next step wasn't another complaint. It was escalation. Within days, requests for records went out, not just to the HOA but to the county. Permits, emails, inspection logs. Mike's report was suddenly part of a larger file, one that included satellite imagery showing changes in WA, turf flow, and vegetation. Sarah flagged inconsistencies and forwarded them to state-level contacts she trusted. Meanwhile, the creek continued to change. The backed-up water had formed shallow pools upstream of the dam, their edges softening into something that looked less like erosion and more like transition. Grasses I couldn't name at first began to take hold, their roots weaving through the sediment. One evening, as the light slanted low, I saw movement near the water's edge. Small, quick, deliberate. Salamanders, their skin dark and glossy, slipping between stones. I knelt there for a long time, watching them, heart pounding for an entirely different reason. Their presence wasn't just notable, it was consequential. When Sarah saw the photos, she exhaled slowly. "Do you realize what this means? I have a pretty good idea. Unauthorized modification of a waterway that results in habitat creation triggers a cascade of protections." It wasn't intuitive, but it was written clearly enough if you knew where to look. The very thing the HOA had done to simplify their landscaping had complicated their legal reality beyond anything they could control. The state responded first, scheduling a joint inspection with federal observers. This time, the notice went to everyone. Panic set in quickly. Veronica sent emails assuring residents that everything was under control, that the inspection was routine. She called me once, leaving a message that was all strained politeness and implied cooperation. I didn't return it. The day of the inspection felt different from the moment the vehicles arrived. There were more of them, marked clearly. People stepped out with equipment, not clipboards. They walked the creek bed, took samples, measured flow. They spoke in low voices, pointing, nodding. Mike was there too, standing a little apart, his usual confidence dulled. When one of the federal scientists asked him about the earlier report, he shifted his weight and said something I couldn't hear. Veronica tried to take charge, hovering near the clubhouse, offering explanations no one asked for. At one point she attempted to redirect the group away from my property. A woman in a windbreaker with an EPA patch listened politely, then shook her head. "We need to see the entire impact area," she said. As the inspection progressed, the mood shifted. What had begun as a procedural review turned into something heavier, more deliberate. The scientists knelt where I'd knelt, studying the pools, the plants, the salamanders. One of them looked up at Sarah and said, "This is significant." Veronica's voice rose, sharp with frustration. "It was just concrete. We can remove it." The scientist met her gaze. "Removal isn't that simple once habitat is established." That was the moment the power dynamic finally broke. By the end of the day, no conclusions were announced, but it didn't matter. The questions being asked were the kind that don't lead to easy answers. Mike left early, avoiding eye contact. Veronica stayed behind, making phone calls, her voice tight. As the last truck pulled away, Sarah stood beside me, watching the creek shimmer in the late afternoon sun. "This," she said quietly, "is where it changes." I nodded. The inspection hadn't just exposed violations, it had revealed something the HOA could never have anticipated, that their attempt to control water had given it new standing, new protection. That night, as I sat on the porch listening to the creek reclaim its voice in small, stubborn ways, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. This wasn't about winning. It was about witnessing the moment when arrogance finally met its limit. And somewhere between the concrete and the water, between the reports and the salamanders, a line had been crossed that no amount of influence could erase. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. It unfolded quietly, day by day, in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The pools upstream of the dam grew clearer as sediment settled into soft layers, each rain adding just enough water to reshape the edges without washing them away. What had started as backed-up flow began to behave like something older, more deliberate. The banks sloped gently now, holding moisture even when the rest of the ground dried out. Plants that had struggled in fast-moving water took hold, their leaves spreading low and wide, catching light and insects alike. I walked the creek every morning, not as an inspector this time, but as a witness. Dragonflies appeared first, hovering with that impossible stillness that always made Martha laugh. Then came the birds, red-winged blackbirds perched on the reeds, great blue herons standing motionless at the far pool like they'd always known it would be there. The salamanders multiplied, their presence no longer a surprise but a pattern. Sarah explained it to me one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, papers spread between mugs gone cold. "This is what they don't understand," she said, tapping a page covered in annotations. "Once a habitat establishes itself, especially one supporting protected species, the law doesn't care how it got there. Intent is irrelevant. So even if they remove the concrete," I said, "it doesn't undo what's already formed." "Exactly. And removing it without authorization would be another violation. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so destructive for everyone involved. The HOA had tried to erase a problem, and instead they'd created something permanent. The very act of interference had elevated the land's status beyond anything their bile AWS could touch. Veronica, however, wasn't ready to accept that. The first attempt to undo the damage happened at night. I heard it before I saw it, the low grind of machinery, the metallic thud of impact echoing down the creek bed. I stepped onto the porch and saw lights moving near the dam, shadows jerking against the trees, jackhammers, someone shouting instructions in a hushed voice. I called Sarah, then the federal contact number we'd been given after the inspection. By the time authorities arrived, the damage was already done. Not the damage Veronica intended, but something far worse for her case. Chunks of concrete lay scattered in the water, creating new obstructions that slowed the flow even more. Fine particles clouded the pools briefly before settling, enriching the sediment layer. What she'd hoped would erase evidence had multiplied it. The report that followed was blunt. Unauthorized demolition, further alteration of protected waters, compounding violations. From that point on, everything accelerated. Notices went out to the HOA outlining interim restrictions. No further work near the creek, no landscaping changes within a specified buffer zone, no chemical treatments, no grading. What had once been a carefully controlled environment suddenly felt constrained. Lawns grew wilder at the edges. Maintenance schedules were suspended. Residents began asking questions that no one on the board could answer. Veronica held emergency meetings assuring people this was temporary, that lawyers were handling it. She spoke with the same confidence she always had, but it rang hollow now. The language had shifted around her. Where she once said, "We've decided," the letters now said, "Pending review." Where she promised quick resolution, the agencies spoke in timelines measured in months, then years. Federal biologists returned with more equipment, more notebooks. HEY tracked amphibian populations, mapped vegetation spread, tested water quality. Each visit added another layer of documentation, another brick in a wall the HOA couldn't climb over. One afternoon, Dr. Rebecca Declan introduced herself as she knelt near the largest pool, carefully lifting a cluster of eggs into a viewing container. "Do you know what you have here?" she asked. "A mess," I said. She smiled. "A recovery site." She explained that northwestern salamanders had been declining across the region, their breeding grounds lost to development and altered waterways. The conditions created here, slow water, shaded pools, rich sediment, were nearly ideal. "This," she said, gesturing around us, "is something we don't get often anymore." Word spread quickly once that assessment made its way into official channels. Environmental groups took interest. University students requested access for study. Journalists called, their questions carefully phrased but unmistakably pointed. Pine Valley, once known for its exclusivity, was becoming known for something else entirely. Residents reacted in waves. At first, there was denial. Surely this couldn't be permanent. Surely someone had made a mistake. Then came anger, directed mostly at the HOA leadership. People demanded to know why permits hadn't been obtained, why risks hadn't been disclosed. Veronica deflected, blamed contractors, cited urgency. It worked less and less each time. Then came fear, when property assessments began to change. The term wetland buffer appeared in documents, followed by development restriction. Appraisers adjusted their models. Listings stalled. The idea that the neighborhood might never return to its former state settled in like a storm cloud. I didn't celebrate any of it. Watching people grapple with loss, financial, emotional, perceived, felt too familiar. I understood grief when I saw it, even when it was wrapped in frustration and blame. But I also saw something else happening, quieter but no less real. Children began exploring the creek edge, drawn by tadpoles and birds. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before stood together during inspections, asking questions, learning names of plants they'd once paid to have removed. One evening, a man named Tom, who lived 3 houses down from the clubhouse, stopped me as I walked past. I didn't get it at first, he said, hands shoved into his pockets. I was angry. Still am, I guess. But my taxes dropped this year. And my kids, they've never cared about the lawn before. Now they're out there every day. Change doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. The formal designation came in stages. First, an interim protection order, then a habitat classification. Finally, the full federal wetland designation, complete with maps and legal descriptions that trace the creek's influence far beyond the original obstruction. Each document was precise, unyielding, Appeals were filed, they failed. The HOA's authority eroded with each ruling. What they could enforce shrank, what they could no longer touch expanded. Veronica's emails grew shorter, less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. When she did appear in public, it was different. The confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle. She spoke to officials now, not residents, and the balance of those conversations had flipped completely. Requests were met with conditions with refusals. The land itself didn't wait for the paperwork finish. It continued adapting, filling in gaps, strengthening what had begun as an accident. Beavers arrived one night without permission, as beavers do, adding their own modifications downstream. Instead of fighting it, the agencies adjusted their models. This, they said, was natural restoration. I stood by the creek one morning after a light rain, watching water spread gently into the surrounding ground, absorbed instead of forced. The oaks Martha planted drank deeply, their leaves glossy and full. I could almost hear her voice, soft and amused. "See," she would have said, "it knew what to do all along." The final blow to the HOA's old way of life wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no public announcements, just a letter sent by certified mail outlining long-term management plans and enforcement authority. It named me as a federal habitat monitor for the area, a role I hadn't sought but understood immediately. 20 years of oversight, access rights, reporting authority. When I signed the acceptance, my hand didn't shake. Veronica tried once more to regain footing, reaching out through intermediaries suggesting compromises. Removal plans, restoration funding. I listened politely, then declined. The system had moved past negotiation. What remained was the land, the water, and a community slowly learning that control isn't the same thing as stewardship. As summer deepened, Pine Valley looked different, less polished, more alive. The creek sang again, not the way it used to, but in a broader, more complex voice. It carried frogs and insects, and the low splash of something larger moving through reeds. Standing there in the evening light, I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Loss had started it. Arrogance had accelerated it. But what endured was something neither of those could destroy. The HOA had tried to block a creek with concrete. In doing so, they'd revealed a truth that couldn't be paved over. Once nature is given space, no matter how accidentally, it remembers exactly how to claim it. And from that point on, the outcome was no longer theirs to decide. By the time the designation became official, most people in Pine Valley had already felt it in quieter ways. The landscapers stopped coming. The HOA newsletters thinned out, then skipped months entirely. What used to be tightly controlled routines gave way to uncertainty, and uncertainty, it turned out, was harder to manage than any creek. The letter arrived on a Thursday, thick with attachments and language that left little room for interpretation. Federal wetland designation, protected habitat, mandatory restoration protocols, long-term monitoring requirements. It spelled out boundaries in coordinates and buffers, lines that cut across backyards and common spaces without regard for lot numbers or purchase prices. Development restrictions were immediate. There would be no appeals, no variances, no exceptions carved out for inconvenience. Veronica resigned the following week. It wasn't announced with ceremony. Just a brief notice posted to the community portal, thanking her for her service. No mention of why she was leaving or what came next. But by then, the rumors were already circulating. People had seen the investigators. They'd heard about the attempted demolition, the reports, the questions that kept coming back sharper than before. Mike Castellanos resigned too. That one came quietly, buried in a county staffing update. Later, through channels I didn't push too hard to trace, I learned he'd agreed to cooperate. The envelope exchange, the incomplete inspection, the pressure to work with. The HOA. It all became part of a larger picture that no longer fit inside a local office. The consequences unfolded slowly, but they were thorough. Property values adjusted downward, sometimes dramatically. Appraisals reflected the new reality, land that could not be altered, improved, or expanded in familiar ways. For some residents, that felt like loss. For others, especially those who'd stretched to afford homes in Pine Valley, it was terrifying. Anger flared, then burned out, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. Taxes dropped. HOA fees disappeared altogether once the association's authority collapsed under the weight of restrictions it could no longer enforce. Conservation easements brought modest compensation and long-term stability for some homeowners, though not enough to make anyone feel rich. What it did bring was finality. The rules were no longer shifting. Through it all, the creek kept doing what it had learned to do: spread, settle, support life. The salamanders thrived. Their numbers tripled by the end of the first season, according to the monitoring reports. Frogs returned in chorus, their calls layering into the evenings until the air itself seemed to vibrate. River otters appeared one morning at dawn, slipping through the water with an ease that felt almost ceremonial. Great blue herons stalked the shallows like patient sentinels. Dr. Rebecca Declan's team published their findings in a regional journal, calling the site one of the most significant amphibian recovery zones documented in the watershed in over 2 decades. The phrase, accidental restoration, appeared more than once, a polite way of acknowledging that none of this had been planned, and yet all of it mattered. Students arrived next. Then educators. Local schools began scheduling field trips, their buses lining up near the old clubhouse, children spilling out with notebooks and Questio. Where there had once been a manicured lawn and a fountain that never quite worked, there were now observation decks and informational signs explaining water flow, plant succession, and the delicate balance of wetland ecosystems. Martha would have loved it. That thought came to me one afternoon as I stood near the oak grove, watching a group of kids crouch near the water, their teacher pointing out a salamander larva wriggling just beneath the surface. The oaks had recovered fully, their roots strengthened by consistent moisture, their canopy broader than it had ever been. Leaves whispered in the breeze, a sound that felt like continuity. The Federal Habitat Monitor role settled into my life with surprising ease. It wasn't about authority in the way people imagine it. There were no badges, no confrontations. Mostly it was observation, reporting, coordination, making sure the protections were respected, the restoration plans followed, answering questions, translating legal language into something people could live with. The salary covered my needs comfortably, the benefits were solid, but the real value was something harder to measure, the assurance that this place, so casually threatened, now had guardianship beyond any single personality or board vote. Veronica's house went into foreclosure 6 months after her resignation. It sold quietly at auction, far below what she'd once hoped to get. The buyer was a researcher affiliated with the state university, someone interested in long-term ecological studies who saw the property not as a loss, but as an opportunity. Fitting, I thought. I saw Veronica once more, months later, outside the courthouse downtown. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence stripped away along with the certainty that had once surrounded her. She didn't see me, or if she did, she chose not to acknowledge it. I didn't stop. Some stories don't need a final confrontation. The community changed in ways no one could have predicted. Without the HOA's constant oversight, neighbors talked to each other more. They shared tools instead of filing complaints. Lawns softened at the edges, native plants replacing imported grasses that required constant correction. The idea of perfection gave way to something more flexible, more forgiving. There were still moments of resentment. Not everyone adjusted easily. Some people moved away, unable to reconcile the investment they'd imagined with the place Pine Valley had become. Others stayed and learned slowly that value isn't always about resale. 8 months after the designation, a small ceremony was held near the creek. No ribbon cutting, no speeches from officials, just a gathering of residents, scientists, and students. A plaque was unveiled near the oak grove, establishing the Martha Hutchinson Environmental Education Fund, a modest endowment to support local conservation efforts and student research. I stood off to the side, listening as someone spoke about resilience, about unintended consequences and second chances. The words washed over me, familiar and distant at the same time. What mattered was the sound behind them, the water, steady and alive. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on the bench by the creek. Fireflies drifted through the air, their lights flickering on and off like small private celebrations. I thought about the night I'd first stepped outside and felt the wrongness of silence. How close this place had come to losing something irreplaceable. Justice doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Sometimes it's not loud or satisfying in the moment. Sometimes it's slow, bureaucratic, rooted in language that feels cold until you see what it protects. But it endures. What happened in Pine Valley wasn't about punishment. It was about limits, about the line between stewardship and control, and what happens when that line is crossed. The HOA had believed it could shape the land to suit its needs, unaware that the laws governing water and life were far older and far less forgiving than any set of bylaws. As the creek moved past me, widening into the wetland it had become, I felt something settle that had been restless since Martha died. Not closure, grief doesn't work that way, but continuity. The sense that care, once given, doesn't disappear. It changes form. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't that individuals can outfight systems, or that corruption always gets caught. It was simpler than that. Attention matters, persistence matters, and sometimes, when you stand your ground for the right reasons, the outcome reshapes more than just a dispute. It reshapes a place. The neighborhood that tried to bury a creek had become defined by it instead. The concrete was still there in places, embedded in the story of how it happened, but it no longer controlled the flow. Water had found its way around it, over it, through it, turning an act of erasure into a foundation for renewal. As darkness settled in and the frogs began their nightly chorus, I listened, letting the sound fill the space where silence had once been. The creek wasn't just back. It was larger, stronger, protected in ways it had never been before. And in that quiet, persistent movement, I understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. You don't have to conquer nature to honor it. Sometimes all you have to do is refuse to let it be silenced.